I'd like to introduce somebody that I've kind of known online for quite a while, and have been really a pretty big admirer of the work that she does, but also the advocacy around accessibility and the importance of really learning your craft. She's author of Modern CSS Dev, all kinds of other learning resources. She's been doing this for about 15 years. She's now the senior design engineer at Adobe Spectrum CSS. Please welcome to the stage Stephanie Eckles.
Hi everyone, hope you're having a good day so far. So today we are going to talk all about CSS, if you couldn't tell already. Admittedly, I am a bit of a CSS fangirl, but can I just say CSS is the moment? Like, we have seen so many features land in just the last few years. If you caught Rachel's talk yesterday, she had an entire slide in like 12-point font with all of the features that have landed very recently. So before we get into it, I do just want to give out a huge kudos to those folks who are working hard to improve CSS, including the CSS working group members, browser engineers, and dedicated community members. It's kind of boggling to think about how few people really make the decisions that impact the language moving forward. So I'm grateful to those that do. As for this talk, my goals are first to inform you about the current state of those edges between these ultra-modern features. The info in this talk should improve your efficiency in troubleshooting when you have these collision points between features as you start to adopt them in your projects. And I hope that it will help you in enabling your team to make future-forward decisions, again, as you bring these recent features into your projects. Also, you might want to have your phone ready to grab QR code links, which I will have sprinkled throughout the presentation. Now, I do have to give this disclaimer. We are talking about super modern things, so the content is subject to change, as all aspects of these features are still a work in progress, so expect browser and spec instability. And I will continue to note that throughout. So, let's get into it. Here we have a lovely grid of cards. And the list item that contains each card has size containment applied. The card component then has a container query that looks up at that container. And so this allows the larger cards, those seen on the second row, to have a different layout that emphasizes the image. Each card also has an actions menu, which is represented by that kebab menu icon. And at the moment, the menu contained within uses absolute positioning and is situated next to the icon in the DOM. So here's what that menu looks like, just some nice icons with the text, pretty standard, fantastic. Except, what happened here? Why is our menu hidden behind those items on the second row, now that it's been opened? And here we have our first feature collision, which is that containment creates a new stacking context. Before I explain what that means, we can see that toggling off containers allows the menu to become visible over those sibling cards. So what's that bit about stacking context, and why is it an issue here? The stacking context defines the way items are placed in the third dimension, or the z-axis. Think of the z-axis as layers of DOM elements between the root of the stacking context within the viewport and you, the user, looking through the browser viewport. If you've used z-index, then you've worked with stacking contexts. And until a new stacking context is created, the root element, often HTML, is the initial stacking context. So, new stacking contexts are created several ways, including container type inline size, which is what's affecting our menu, or size. Other ways to create new stacking contexts includes a fixed or sticky positioned element, or combining position absolute or relative, along with a z-index. There's a few other kind of strange scenarios, so if you're interested in this, I encourage you to find the full list on MDN. So while z-index is a way to manage the stacking order, the key concept affecting our menu is that an element can only be relayered within the same stacking context. Yeah.
Mind using this?
All right. Sorry about that. Okay. So in practical terms, that means we can astronomically set that z-index. You might be familiar with this troubleshooting technique that often doesn't work for you. Well, now you know why. It's the stacking context. But especially here, it's not ever going to resolve this issue of having our menu hidden behind the sibling elements, since those each create a new stacking context due to the applied containment of each list item. But we want to keep our container queries. It's kind of a key part of our layout here. So what can we do? Okay, here's where I have to interject and say a hot and fresh update as of literally like a week ago to be aware of is that the CSS working group resolved that container type will no longer create a new stacking context. This leaves us kind of in a mixed scenario though in the interim, and it may impact layouts that you've already developed. This is in Chromium 129, marked fixed in Safari, but not yet rolled out to major version, and there's a Firefox bug to make this change. Well, fortunately, we do have another method on the horizon, and it's going to break us completely free from the stacking context restraint. And that is the popover API, which is actually cross-browser as of the release of Safari 17 about a month ago. While popovers are not technically part of the CSS side of the house, they do give us access to a unique CSS feature, which is the top layer. The top layer is guaranteed to be the topmost layer above any other stacking context. It spans the entire viewport, although elements existing can have smaller visible dimensions. And when you promote an element to the top layer, it breaks it free of any of those stacking contexts that it may otherwise exist within. Currently, there is not a CSS property to assign an element to the top layer, but rather it's used in the following contexts. Full screen elements, when triggered from element requests full screen, which is mostly your video element in full screen mode. The dialog element, specifically when launched through show modal, and of course, popovers. So what does it take to create a popover? This is literally it. There's no hidden JavaScript that I'm also adding. So what's going on? Let's look at the pieces. First, add the attribute popover target to a button with a value that matches an ID of an element with the popover attribute. And ta-da, you have a toggleable popover. The popover will be hidden until it's toggled open. And important to note is that the default browser style of the popover is to have a fixed element centered within the viewport. So this does leave us with the remaining problem of repositioning that and associating it to the relative trigger. But before we get into positioning our popover, let's just appreciate that adding the popover related attributes promoted the element to the top layer and allowed us to keep our container. So how did we get the menu so nicely positioned next to the trigger? Well, you may notice some extra inline styles to assign a custom property called anchor name. I'm using that property in my rules for anchor positioning, which is one of the most modernist CSS features. Now here, there definitely be dragons. We have browser, spec, instability, and a partial implementation is currently available in Chromium browsers. Anchor positioned elements can have their position set relative to the defined anchor element. So in this example, we have a popover, and it's anchored to that favored button. The anchor positioning spec provides several new properties and keywords to create that relationship and precisely position the anchored element. We don't have time to cover the syntax in depth, but this graphic from MDN covers the basics, and I encourage you to seek that out if you're interested to learn more. But I will cover a starting point. So, to create a basic anchor positioning relationship, the element that serves as the anchor is given an anchor name. And to position multiple anchors, you will have to have this name be unique, so that's why I opt to use a custom property. Then the anchored element will be positioned relative to the anchor, and that requires, or to have that relationship, requires a position of either fixed or absolute. The association to the anchor is created by using the position anchor property. And this needs to be the same value as the anchor name, so we've made that a little easier by sharing the custom property. But it's not officially positioned relative to the anchor without one of the available positioning features. And for simple use, I recommend use of position area, which uses those relative values found in that kind of complicated looking graphic on the previous slide. Additionally, there are a couple of ways to dynamically position the popover or other anchored element when it's at risk of causing overflow. For our cards menu, I'm using position try flip block. And this is going to flip the menu in the block direction when it approaches the viewport edge. Again, no hidden JavaScript. For popover specifically, you'll also need to add inset auto to override the default browser style of inset 0. This essentially reduces the observed size of the viewport to the, or the observed area for this positioning to the size of the popover. Otherwise, it might be the size of your document and lead to unexpected behavior and not have that flip at the viewport edges. I actually went down quite a trip to figure out why this wasn't working for me. I wrote an intersection observer. I went the very hard route before finding a small note in a web.dev article that told me this, and that resolved it. So I definitely, as you see noted here, I recommend adding this to your CSS reset so you can avoid that very tricky troubleshooting, because it won't appear correctly in DevTools either, which makes it extra hard. Now, I'm also noting a CSS working group issue, and there's a proposal by Tab Atkins to actually fix this initial style, like in the browser user agent styles for anchored popover specifically, so that you don't run into the pitfall. But anyway, if you have issues with position try, you're probably missing inset auto if you're also using it with popover. Okay, so we have our nice grid of cards. Our menus are now within popover. We're giving this a little try. Got anchor positioning. And, oh, it's overlapping our sticky header. That seems unfortunate. So here's our next feature collision. And this is back to the fact that top layer elements exist above all other page elements. Again, we already mentioned this, and I will say that often this is a good thing, and in fact, this is usually a selling point for switching to using popover. In fact, that's why we did it originally, right? But the impact here means that we can't try to do something like set that high Z index to have this sticky header appear over an open popover. So what can we do in this situation? A partial fix is to use the position visibility property with the value anchors visible. The result of this is that once the anchor is not visible on screen, the associated anchor element is hidden. But as you can see, there's still a period of visible overlap of the menu and the sticky header. Now, the immediate cautions here are around accessibility. For using position visibility. And the first issue, is that position visibility is a feature of anchor positioning. but there's no shared context of what is being positioned, meaning the anchor doesn't know it's attached to a popover, and moreover, it doesn't know that that popover has interactive content. So when that hidden kicks in, it acts like visibility hidden is applied, which means it's hidden only visually, but it maintains its space, technically, and accessible access. So the impact here is quite a poor experience for our visual keyboard users, since their tab position may be stuck in an invisible element. And when that moves out of the viewport, it also conceals the visible focus position. So to prove that, I've added a focus tracking script. It's going to log out the active element, and we're navigating into the menu with the keyboard. We see it disappear, but we also see it logged out that our focus is still maintained. We're still navigating and able to focus the buttons in that hidden element. So basically, this feature unfortunately has negative impact for any popover or other anchored content with interactive features. And in fact, it's severe enough to be a WCAG failure for hidden elements to be able to gain focus. So basically, while this may be an appropriate feature for other types of anchored content, it's not appropriate for our menu popover use case. So we have an imperfect answer here, as this possibly gets us back to the issue we originally escaped by using popover, which was the menu being hidden due to container query stacking context. But I'll tell you, this issue is pretty much exactly why I chose this topic for the presentation today, which was to provide you the info so you can make an informed decision and have more knowledge when you are troubleshooting these collision points. For this particular scenario, it's time to have a discussion with your design team, probably. You can discuss the trade-offs of keeping the sticky element, go ahead and lose it, versus potentially losing the container queries, or having to try to work out a heavier JS solution to make all those pieces come together. There's definitely a possibility you can work out a progressively enhanced solution as well. Okay, time to switch gears. Look at this nice button. Now look at this same button, but in a different browser. What is causing that background to fail in the hover state? Well, to find out, we have to learn more about invalid at computed value time, or IACVT. Computed value time is the stage at which the browser assigns values to custom properties. If a custom property value is computed as invalid, the browser will use either an inherited value from an ancestor or the initial value for the property. The key concept to take away is that invalid custom properties will not fall back to cascaded values targeting the same elements. So let's look at an example, because I know that was a lot of words that probably didn't make a lot of sense. So, in this example, it means that the card paragraph will be the inherited color value of red as provided by the body. It is unable to use the cascaded value of blue due to the browser discarding that as a possible value candidate at computed value time. It's only when the browser attempts to apply the value that it realizes it is invalid. There's a lot more nuance to IACVT that we don't have time to cover today. So if you want to learn more, see more examples, have that idea click a little bit more, check that link out. And as I know, it's not a tracking link. So let's see how this concept is impacting our hover button state. For the hover state, we are modifying the color primary original value using the super incredible relative color syntax. However, it is such a cutting edge feature that there's definitely a chance you'll have users encounter this button on browsers that don't support it yet. The result is that for the background color, in a browser that doesn't support relative color syntax, the background color is instead using the initial value, which happens to be transparent, effectively entirely removing the background color. And that's certainly going to be an issue for our users. Now you could go spelunking through the specs to find the initial value, but to do it a bit more efficiently, I suggest referencing the formal definition out on MDN for any CSS property. There are a few strategies for remediating this issue, which are discussed in the article I referenced earlier. But for today, we are going to wrap this ultra-modern syntax in an @supports query. Now, we're proactively telling the browser, hey, unless you can verify this @support statement, go ahead and skip this. Don't even attempt to apply this value, which means it will successfully use our fallback value from the cascade of color primary, which is just a basic hex value. Again, another article for different support strategies if you're interested, beyond just @supports and how to kind of handle feature detection. Okay, let's move on to a theming related property, which is color scheme. Use of color scheme lets you tell the browser which color themes you support and with what priority. So in this rule, we're saying that we support both light and dark themes with light as the priority. Once color scheme is set, we can flip over to emulate dark mode and notice that the default background color and text colors did a simple flip. Additionally, the reason I'm showing form inputs in this example is because the applied colors through color scheme will also adjust form inputs to improve their contrast with either a dark or light background. Now, quite often we customize the background color, so let's see how that can impact the behavior. And yeah, that's no longer giving us quite the same benefit. The collision here is that our author styles are overriding the color scheme system defaults. And again, that's a good thing, actually. But let's see how we can make color scheme and author styles work in harmony. Depending on how much you want to control the customization of alternate themes, one option is to have custom authored styles for your default mode, and then within the color scheme feature query, defer to system colors for the opposite mode, which are canvas for the background color and canvas text for text color. To go beyond the browser defaults and provide even more customized color options, depending on the value of color scheme, you can use the cutting-edge CSS function light dark. Note that we do have to include color scheme with both values for light dark to work, but once that's included, for any property or any position in a property that accepts a color value, you can use the light dark function, where the first color displays for light and the second for dark mode. As a bonus, in this snippet, I have included another property you should definitely know about, which is accent color. It's a single liner for changing the color of form inputs, which you'll see in our example. So here's our custom colors provided by light dark in action. Disclaimer that I'm not a designer. But particularly when we get to dark mode, you can see the effect of our customized accent color on the form inputs. Okay, again, another warning. I have to warn you that there is a severe risk of IACVT, even though you may not be using custom properties. It can still impact here. So support for light dark is super newly baseline just as of May. And so you do have a potential for color loss in unsupporting browsers. However, the color scheme property has been supported since early 2002 or 2022. So depending on the extent of your usage of light dark, you could still go forward and use it. And the fallback may be that we have those system colors that we're responding to the light and dark. If you really want to start using light dark, I do recommend wrapping it in an @supports query. The great thing about this strategy is that you'll have a super smooth upgrade path. You'll just unwrap those styles when your desired support is achieved, and then remove the fallback styles and enjoy watching the size of your style sheets shrink. Or continue doing what you've probably been doing for quite some time. Continue using the prefers color scheme media queries and postpone using light dark for now. You can still pick up some nice progressive enhancement though by incorporating the color scheme property. Okay, it's time for the lightning round of stuff to stick in your brain about 3 pretty recent features that impact CSS architecture decisions and have pitfall potential. The features are nesting, cascade layers, and @scope. And we definitely need to throw up a warning about browser and spec instability. First up is native CSS nesting. A potential gotcha if you're new to nesting is that the use of the ampersand refers to the base selector, and it's required if you're trying to append pseudo selectors and pseudo elements. So in this example, nesting just the hover pseudo class by itself would select child elements that are being hovered, whereas combining with the ampersand selector is how you would get the base elements selected when hovered. It's also important to understand that when using nesting, the specificity is evaluated as if is was in use. So in this example, the specificity of the nested selector, the class of other, is 110, since it includes the ID. Finally, for nesting, media queries are moved and evaluated at the end of your nesting block, which may flip your style sheet order and lead to a mismatch of your expectations of the cascaded rules. So in the nested version, the media query background color of cyan will win for light mode, since it will be evaluated as if the media query came at the end. But for rules outside of nesting, regular cascaded order results in the non-media query winning. Except, once again, that behavior is changing, as of Chrome 130 at least. So specifically because of this new resolution to add CSS nested declarations. Literally, the blog post in this QR was written 3 days ago, the 8th. So, in other words, those media queries and other rules will no longer move, but remain in your original order. So you might have kind of a mixed result in any styles you may have already written. Brahmas explains the issue and goes into more examples in that blog. Next up is cascade layers, and if you're newer to these, it's important to understand that unlayered styles have priority over layered styles, and additionally, the less layered styles have priority over deeper layered styles. I always blame Miriam Suzanne for making me say layer so many times when I talk about these. So here's an example of that in practice. For the cards H2, the simple H2 element style is winning over the layered style, even though the layered style under classic specificity rules would have won out. But good news, you can offer your opinion to the relevant working group issue. They're discussing a way to allow authors to explicitly place those unlayered styles, so potentially you could choose to not have them take priority. An additional behavior to know that is actually a core feature of cascade layers is that rules with less specificity win when placed in later or unlayered layers. This is actually a key feature of cascade layers, which is about turning over control of specificity to authors. But this specific result can be confusing if you're trying to update and use layers in your CSS architecture. Finally, we'll look at some interesting behavior about scope. The first thing to know is that higher specificity rules will still win over scope styles, as the @scope block doesn't inherently increase specificity. So, means when both a global and scope style apply, such as to the card H2, the higher specificity rule still wins. However, if specificity is equal between a scoped rule and an unscoped rule, the scoped rule will win due to scope proximity. This new phase of the CSS cascade is checked after specificity and before order of appearance. So new phase to be aware of. And as far as scope, we also have a new selector, the colon scope, which evaluates as a pseudo class. This means that if you choose to use it in your scope styles, it will add 1 point for specificity in the class position. And if you use the ampersand, it evaluates as if you're wrapping with is again. So that is going to be equivalent specificity to the highest specificity in that calculation. Practically meaning that you might unintentionally increase the specificity using the ampersand depending on your scoping root selectors. I got the 1 minute flag. Can I go into QA just a little bit? Okay. About 4 minutes to do this category, but I wanted to take a look and see how many of the features I've mentioned worked with Shadow DOM. And I appreciate that this title may read like a horror movie title for some of you. So what I hope is that if the tips here are relevant to you, it will save you some time making decisions, troubleshooting issues with CSS features and web components. So also note that all features work independently inside of Shadow DOM. So if you just write them there, they'll work. But they may or may not cross the boundary between global and shadow styles, which is the kind of focus of my notes here. So the most complicated part of this is the impact on the basic rules of the CSS cascade. I had to look up so many resources and videos to understand this myself. So I am going to give you a resource to look at for this too. First to know, only inheritable properties may apply to the shadow content. Specifically, inheritable properties apply to shadow elements if they come from ancestors. A unique case is slotted content because it technically exists in the light DOM unless you're slotting another web component. And so what this means is that the outer context or your global styles have precedence or will win over the inner context of the shadow DOM. So again, global style sheets win even above specificity. The exception is if you use important on styles, targeting the slotted content, and then use of important will win again over global styles. So here's the resource. I didn't get a QR code made, but this video from Manuel is all about the cascade. And so here's a section where he's showing that the light DOM is styled in the global context. The shadow DOM styles the second heading red because it's just normal, but it's also a shadow element being styled in the shadow DOM. And the third one is the slotted content, which is that weird area where it exists in light DOM. It would have been blue, but we've added important in our shadow styles, so now it's green. Yeah, again, that's complicated. I appreciate that. So be sure to check out Manuel's video. As for cascade layers in the shadow DOM, they don't cross the boundary beyond any applicable inheritance, so still have the inheritance rule. And practically speaking, this means you cannot make use of or modify the global layer order from within the shadow DOM. For scope, if you're using it, know that the global context scope cannot cross the shadow boundary and apply to shadow elements, again, except for inheritance. However, they may apply to your slotted light DOM content. And there is browser inconsistency with using @scope. I'm going to skip drilling to the details, but I will share my slides later. Basically, a little bit of broken behavior, so still a work in progress. The awesome news about container queries, though, is that we have basic cross-browser access to global containers from within the shadow DOM, meaning you can query containers external to your shadow DOM to modify your shadow element styles. So that's great, and this QR is to a web platform test. You can drill into the details of what's supported and not. and keep track of that. We didn't get to talk about app property much, but if you're using it, know that it must be defined in your global context. It won't work to define app property inside of Shadow DOM, or at least in my tests so far. That could change. But just for basic interaction, the initial value will cross the shadow boundary. So you still also get the typing and quote-unquote safety will work as expected. So basically, as long as it sits in the global context, you still reap the benefits. Again, another article, dig in more later. And our very last one to wrap this all up is anchor positioning, since we talked about that quite a bit today. So definitely wanted to check that with Shadow DOM. Mixed bag here. You're unable to anchor a global element to a Shadow DOM element. You're also unable to anchor a Shadow DOM element to a slotted light DOM element. That one's unfortunate, I think. But you can anchor a global element to the custom element itself, since that exists, light DOM. And you can anchor a global element to slotted content that exists in the light DOM, which could be confusing. And of course, you can anchor within this Shadow DOM because you're all existing in the same context. So all of that to say, if you're working with web components, considering using popovers, think about this if you're also looking at anchor positioning. All right, I'm at the end. But the last thing I wanted to share is that I really don't want you to be frustrated about how many times I had to say, the spec is evolving, or features just changed. Because the truth is, an evolving spec is part of the process, and it's why these features are released in at least some browsers early, so that you as the developer community can get in there, try them out, report bugs, and make them even better. So throughout the presentation, I noted different working group issues. Go look them up on GitHub. Everything's public. You can add your own comments, and again, help make those features even better. I'm a super nerd about this. Please find me to talk about more of the things later. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'm green. Okay, how about now? Anything? We good? Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Stephanie. If you join me for a little bit, we got a little bit of Q&A. Got some questions coming in. We've got our QR code if you've got more. I wanted to start with one that I think is an important thing for us, especially in light of what you've been sharing around the state of finality and full-bakedness of all of these things. Can you talk a little bit about the benefit of using something like @supports, as well as that fallback while waiting for full support when you're working with any of these features?
Yeah, so a few things with @supports and kind of generally considering your support strategy. If you're really keen on using the feature, then @supports is an amazing tool. You also probably need to think about how critical are those styles to your application. So even in the example I showed, all we were really modifying was a hover background color. Arguably, that's okay if it doesn't change, or you could do a little more work beyond what I showed to still have it change to a basic value. But if it's really critical to your app that, say, you have a user settings to apply theming when you're doing something like dealing with the color functions, so you really want something like light dark to work, you might have to have a heavier-handed solution where you're still doing the work and adding classes, having some sort of server-side stuff that you're doing or JavaScript-side stuff that you're doing. So it all really comes down to what is the goal you're trying to accomplish with using that feature? How critical is it to your app? And if it's a progressive enhancement, then again, @supports is a really great solution for you there.
Great, thank you. There were a few other things about some of the mechanics of things that you were showing. One was about that focus tracking script. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, and is that something that people can use?
Yeah, so I just popped that in the console. That comes from, I should have put my source. That comes from an article by Sarah Higley, who's wonderful in the accessibility community, an article that she has about focus trapping, I believe, if you want to seek that out. So just a quick little script. You can pop it in your console as a troubleshooting tool.
Great. That's sort of been a running theme with a couple of the talks around trying these things out and then figuring out how and where they're going wrong. So I think it's nice that we have a couple of ways that people have been sharing with us about how to control that, like Matt's talk about caching and how to manage that stuff. So thank you for sharing that. Now, Sarah is also asking a bit about the shadow DOM. Am I missing out by not using the shadow DOM?
That's an extremely hot drama question. And I don't feel fully qualified to answer. I also am I looked it up because I have now switched to a position where I too need to learn more about web components. So I am at the beginning of my learning journey too, but because, if you're in a design systems team like myself who is supporting a web components team, this is the details you'll want to look into and learn because it's very possible. I guess the 2-second answer on why you would use Shadow DOM is if you're also using slotted content, which again, if you're new to web components, that might not make sense yet. But anyway, you can get away without it unless you want slots, which increases flexibility. So, yeah.
Well, I think that was a bit of a loaded question, I know, because there's a shadow DOM, there's a virtual DOM, everybody's got their competing things about it. But I think what it really comes back to is what you were talking about with specificity, and really, I think when we're talking about front end, we're really talking about HTML and CSS. The other stuff is manipulating it, but in understanding those transitions and where to look when you're having problems, I think that was sort of the common thread. Because I think that you had started off with the popovers and the stacking context and all of that. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on some of the other ways to create that context other than position. So is there an alternative, given that the popover API is maybe not the most appropriate way in some cases? Yeah, so
I'm thinking of, I can go off my own experience. So I know at least with React, possibly other frameworks that provide, components. A popular technique, if you have a popover or a homegrown dialog that isn't using HTML dialog, is to move the element that you're opening up, like the popover, to the end of your DOM. So in other words, then you're sharing the same kind of global stacking context, that root stacking context, which means you can manipulate it up over something like a sticky header. So essentially, if you can't quite yet use popover, can't quite yet use anchor positioning, that's kind of the fallback for now. Because there's just no other way to escape the CSS constraint.
Sure. There was a question about CSS methodologies and Tailwind and that sort of thing. I know you're working on a large system. I work on a fairly sizable design system as well. We're kind of getting down to the end of time. What are your thoughts on those sorts of methodologies, or do you tend to focus on just writing the CSS on its own?
In my own projects, I'm a from scratcher, but that probably isn't too surprising. Something like Tailwind or some of these other tools I know that teams will choose them, what I found, mostly for documentation purposes. They don't want to maintain their own documentation. So in other words, there's so many learning resources, it has a built-in community. So I appreciate that those are reasons people choose those other tools. Additionally, they might not be on a design system team, or at least an enterprise design system team, where there's folks that want to have more control, be more specific, have more input on naming conventions, all these different things. So I appreciate that it depends on the size of your team, the makeup of your team, access to designers, all of it's contextual. So use what works for you, I guess.
I'm going to break the rule about not going over because I want to ask you one more question. Because it really, I think, is germane to everybody in this room. It's such a fast-moving industry. Things are evolving so quickly. How do you keep up to date with this? How do you sort of maintain your own kind of culture of learning?
Yeah, do conference talks because it forces you to research. That helps. Yeah, I have a blog. It's not super maintained, but beyond, kind of what I'm trying to say is I encourage you to experiment. Like if something interests you, check it out, look at the working group. But just generally to keep on top, There's quite a few really great industry newsletter, Front End Focus I really like, CSS Weekly. I have several others that aren't coming to top of mind. Also, the browsers have become much better at having release notes that are more reader-friendly to just scan through, see what's going on. Additionally, like web.dev, Rachel specifically does a roundup of what's new to the platform every month, so that's extremely reader-friendly and easy to look up. And then also following the browser DevRel people, because they're going to be constantly posting about what's going on.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. This has
Thank you.
been fantastic. I know I've learned a ton. We've been scheming about things that we want to build into our system now. Another round of applause for Stephanie, please.